Marcus Halbridge fired Yetunde Okonkwo at 9:11 on a Wednesday morning in his corner office on the 40th floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. With the door closed and only his head of human resources present as a witness, he had rehearsed the conversation for 3 days. He had used the phrase cultural fit twice. He had used the phrase not the right energy once. He had used the word attitude 4 times, 3 of them in the same sentence. He had told Yetunde, who was 43 years old and had been the firm's managing director of capital markets for the previous 6 years, that her last day would be the following Friday, that her severance would be generous, and that he wished her well in her future endeavors. Yetunde had not raised her voice. She had not argued. She had not asked for clarification on which specific incidents of attitude he was referring to. She had asked, instead, one question: whether she would be permitted to make personal phone calls from her office between now and Friday, or whether she should plan to make them from a coffee shop. Marcus had paused. He had said magnanimously that of course she could use her office. She had thanked him. She had stood up. She had walked out. The head of HR had remained in the office for another 90 seconds, finalizing paperwork. By the time the head of HR walked back to her own office on the 38th floor, Yetunde Okonkwo had already made the first of 7 phone calls she would make over the next 4 hours, each one to a different limited partner in Halbridge Capital's flagship fund. Each one taking between 11 and 23 minutes, each one ending in the same way, with a careful, unhurried thank you from Yetunde, and with the careful, unhurried understanding on both ends of the call that the conversation was now formally on the record. By 1:47 p.m., Marcus Halbridge's executive assistant was buzzing him with the first of the calls he would receive that afternoon. The first call was from a managing partner at one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. The managing partner had committed $300 million to Halbridge Capital's current vintage fund 19 months earlier. The managing partner was, at that moment, on speakerphone in a conference room in Riyadh with 7 members of his investment committee. He had a single question for Marcus, which he asked without preamble. Is it true that you have terminated Ms. Okonkwo? 16 years earlier, Yetunde Okonkwo had been 27 years old in her second year of a finance MBA at Wharton, working a 100-hour summer internship at a Midtown investment bank that her classmates had called the best opportunity available to a person of her cohort. The bank had not been the best opportunity. It had been the opportunity she had taken because her father, an electrical engineer who had been laid off in 2008 and had not worked steadily since, had cried, very briefly, and only once, the night she had told him she had been accepted to Wharton. She had been the first member of her family to attend graduate school. She had been the first member of her family to attend any school in the United States, including kindergarten, since her parents had emigrated from Lagos to Houston in 1979. She had spent that summer at the bank, working under a managing director named Howard Pemberton, who had told her on her 3rd day in front of 2 other analysts that she had an interesting energy and that he hoped she would find her place at the firm. She had heard the phrase "find your place" approximately 400 times in her professional life since. She had developed, over the years, a particular relationship with the phrase. She did not argue with it. She did not become visibly offended by it. She filed it away in the place she filed such phrases, which had grown roomy, and she continued working. Howard Pemberton had also told her, 6 weeks into the internship, that she would not be receiving a return offer because she had not shown enough hunger. Yetunde had not asked him to elaborate. She had thanked him. She had completed her MBA the following spring. She had taken a position at a different firm, smaller and less prestigious, where the chief executive, a woman in her 60s named Margaret Chen, had hired her after a single 20-minute interview during which Margaret had asked her 3 questions and had then said, "Yetunde, I don't need you to be hungry. I need you to be excellent. Welcome to the firm." Yetunde had stayed at Margaret's firm for 9 years. By the time Margaret retired and the firm was acquired, Yetunde had been a partner. She had been recruited to Halbridge Capital 7 years before the morning of her firing. She had been recruited specifically by Marcus Halbridge himself, who had been at the time a 42-year-old founding partner of a 4-year-old private equity firm that had raised $1.5 billion across 2 vintage funds, and that was attempting, with mixed results, to break into the institutional limited partner market dominated by sovereign wealth funds, public pension plans, and the largest university endowments. Marcus had hired Yetunde because his head of fundraising at the time, a woman named Linda whom Marcus had not particularly listened to, had told him 3 times that he could not break into the institutional market without a senior person whose technical sophistication matched the diligent sophistication of the institutional LPs themselves. Linda had recommended Yetunde specifically. Linda had retired 6 months after Yetunde's arrival, in part because Marcus had stopped listening to her almost entirely. Yetunde had stayed. For the next 6 years, Yetunde Okonkwo had done a particular kind of work. The work was not the work that appeared in the firm's marketing materials. The work that appeared in the marketing materials involved Marcus Halbridge's name, Marcus Halbridge's keynote speeches at industry conferences, and the careful curated story of Marcus Halbridge as a visionary investor who had built Halbridge Capital from nothing. The work Yetunde had done was different. Yetunde had spent 6 years on airplanes. She had traveled, by the count of her own assistant, approximately 140,000 miles a year. She had flown to Abu Dhabi 11 times. She had flown to Singapore 8 times. She had flown to Sacramento, where the California Public Employees Retirement System maintained its offices, 23 times. She had spent 541 nights in hotel rooms over 6 years. She had developed personal working relationships with 64 institutional limited partners across 4 continents, including the 7 largest LPs in Halbridge Capital's current vintage fund, who collectively represented $620 million of the fund's $2.4 billion capital base. 5 of those 7 LPs had committed to Halbridge Capital specifically because of Yetunde. They had told her so. They had also, in 3 separate instances over the past 2 years, told her something else, that the firm's leadership had been showing signs of internal disarray, that Marcus Halbridge's increasingly erratic public statements were concerning to their investment committees, and that they wished to be kept informed if Yetunde's role at the firm changed. She had not asked them what they meant. She had not needed to. Marcus Halbridge was 53 years old. He had built Halbridge Capital from a single fund into a $6 billion firm over the course of 11 years. He had earned, in the process, a personal net worth probably north of $400 million. He had grown increasingly impatient with disagreement over the past 3 years. He had begun to interrupt his partners in meetings, to dismiss diligence findings he did not want to hear, and to make hiring and firing decisions on the basis of what he called energy and what his partners had begun to identify as something else. He had also begun, over the past 18 months, to develop a particular sensitivity to Yetunde. He had noticed, in a way that operated below the level of his own deliberate articulation, that the firm's largest LPs increasingly directed their substantive questions to her rather than to him. He had noticed that she had been invited, twice in the past year, to keynote panels at industry conferences that he had previously headlined. He had noticed that she had been profiled the previous spring in a trade publication that had described her as the operational backbone of Halbridge Capital, a phrase Marcus had read 4 times in the office of his personal trainer and had not enjoyed. Yetunde Okonkwo was not, by the assessment of her colleagues, an easy person to work with. She did not socialize after work. She did not find funny. She had told 2 of Halbridge Capital's managing directors in the previous year that their analysis was wrong in language that the 2 managing directors had described to Marcus as unnecessarily blunt. The analysis had, in both cases, been wrong. Yetunde had been right. The fund had avoided 2 transactions that would have collectively lost approximately $78 million. Marcus had not acknowledged this when the analysis was confirmed. Yetunde had not asked for acknowledgement. She had a particular professional philosophy, developed over 20 years in finance, which was that recognition was a coin issued at the discretion of people who had never been generous with it, and that the only reliable currency available to a Black woman in her industry was the work itself. She had operated on this philosophy for 2 decades. The philosophy had cost her, in approximately equal measure, friends and respect. She had decided early which of the 2 she could not do her job without. The firing on Wednesday morning had not been a surprise. Yetunde had been aware that Marcus had been complaining about her to 2 of his fellow partners for the previous 4 months. She had been aware because one of the 2 partners, a man named David Castellanos, who had joined the firm 2 years earlier and had become In his own quiet way, an ally had told her over dinner 6 weeks earlier that Marcus had been using the phrase attitude problem in private conversations and that David believed something was coming. Yetunde had thanked David for the warning. She had begun that same week to organize her files. She had also begun, in the careful, unhurried way she did everything, to make the small preparatory moves she would need to make if she was correct about what was coming. She had updated her records. She had ensured that her work product for the past 6 years was clearly documented, with dates and authorship clearly preserved in the firm's shared file system and in her own personal records. She had reviewed her employment contract with her personal attorney. She had identified, by working through her own LP Rolodex, the 7 LPs who would most likely want to be informed if she was terminated. She had not contacted them in advance. She had decided on principle that she would not preemptively recruit her own constituency. She had decided that if the firing happened, she would make the calls afterward, and she would let the LPs themselves decide what to do with the information. The firing happened at 9:11 on a Wednesday morning. Yetunde made her first call at 9:34. The call was to Faisal Al-Mansouri, the managing director of public investments at the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, with whom she had been working for 5 years. She had texted him from her office at 9:22, saying that she needed 20 minutes of his time. He had cleared a meeting and called her at 9:34. The call lasted 17 minutes. She told him calmly and without editorialization that she had been terminated by Marcus Halbridge at 9:11 that morning, that the stated reason had been attitude, that she had been offered severance and a Friday departure, and that she was making the call because she had told him 18 months earlier, when his fund had committed to the current vintage, that she would inform him personally if her role at the firm changed. She was now informing him. She had no requests. She wished him well. She thanked him for 5 excellent years. Faisal had been silent for 4 seconds. Then he had said, "Yetunde, I need to call my chair. I will call you back within the hour. Please do not leave the office before then." He had called her back at 10:41 a.m. He had said, "We are in an emergency session of the investment committee. Please hold." She had also, during the holding, made her 2nd through 7th calls. Each of the 7 calls had gone in approximately the same way. By 1:30 p.m., Yetunde Okonkwo had personally informed the senior decision-makers at 7 institutional limited partners, representing collectively $620 million of Halbridge Capital's current fund commitments, that she had been terminated that morning for reasons she would not characterize but which the LPs themselves were free to evaluate. The first call to Marcus came at 1:47 p.m. It was Faisal Al-Mansouri calling from Riyadh on speakerphone in a conference room with 7 members of his investment committee present. The committee included the chair of the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority's private equity allocation, who had personally signed the commitment letter for ADIS $300 million investment in Halbridge Capital's current fund 19 months earlier. The committee chair did not introduce herself. Faisal did. Faisal said, "Mr. Halbridge, is it true that you have terminated Ms. Okonkwo?" Marcus had been at his desk, eating lunch. He had set down his sandwich. He had said in the voice he used with LPs whose questions he was not expecting, "Faisal, hello. Yes, there has been a personnel transition this morning. I would be happy to discuss it. Yetunde and I had reached an impasse on a number of matters of firm culture, and we mutually agreed. I did not ask about the circumstances. I asked whether it was true. Please answer the question I asked." The room behind Marcus's office had gone silent in the way executive suites go silent when an assistant has overheard the wrong tone on a speakerphone. "Yes, Faisal. It is true. Thank you. The investment committee at the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority has met in emergency session this morning. The committee has voted unanimously to invoke our rights under Section 8.4 of our limited partnership agreement, which permits us to issue a notice of intent to withdraw our commitment in the event of a material change in the firm's senior personnel without prior consultation with us. You signed that agreement, Mr. Halbridge. I assume you have access to it. We are issuing the notice this afternoon. The notice will be effective in 30 days. If Ms. Okonkwo is not reinstated within those 30 days, in her current role and with her full responsibilities and authorities intact, our $300 million commitment will be withdrawn. We will also be making a public statement jointly with several of our peer institutions regarding our rationale. I would suggest you consult with your fellow partners and with your own counsel. We will not be available for further discussion of this matter today. Good afternoon." The line clicked off. Marcus sat at his desk for 45 seconds. He picked up his phone. He called his head of investor relations. He told her to come to his office immediately. While he waited, the phone rang again. It was CalPERS. The CalPERS managing investment officer was on the call with 3 members of her senior staff. They had a single question, almost verbatim the same question Faisal had asked. They received the same answer. They informed Marcus, with the same measured professionalism, that they were exercising the same provision in their own LPA. Their commitment was $85 million. The notice period was 30 days. The condition for withdrawal was identical: reinstatement of Yetunde Okonkwo in her current role and with her full authorities within 30 days. The third call was from the chief investment officer of a Canadian public pension plan. $50 million. The fourth call was from the head of alternatives at a European insurance company. $40 million. The fifth call was from the chair of the investment committee of a major American university endowment. $75 million. Each asked the same question. Each received the same answer. Each gave the same response. By 4:30 p.m., 6 of the 7 LPs Yetunde had called had formally indicated in writing that they intended to withdraw their commitments unless Yetunde was reinstated. The collective total of the threatened withdrawals was $517 million. The 7th LP, the smallest of the 7, had not yet formally responded but had informed Marcus's head of investor relations that an emergency board meeting had been scheduled for the following morning and that the LP's likely vote would follow the others. David Castellanos walked into Marcus's office at 5:15 p.m. without knocking. He closed the door behind him. He said, "Marcus, we need to talk." Marcus said, "David, I am dealing with a situation." David said, "Marcus, I am the situation. Sit down. I have spoken with 3 of our LPs in the past 2 hours on my own initiative, and I am here to tell you what is going to happen tomorrow morning if you do not reverse this decision tonight." David explained over the next 40 minutes was the following. The LPs would not only withdraw their current commitments, they would also, through their substantial overlapping networks within the institutional LP community, communicate the circumstances of Yetunde's termination to every prospective LP that Halbridge Capital had been courting for its next vintage fund, the fundraising for which was scheduled to begin in 6 months. The information would reach those LPs within 48 hours. The information would not be characterized as a personnel dispute. It would be characterized, David read from notes he had taken during his 3 conversations, as evidence of a fundamental misalignment between firm leadership and institutional values. The next vintage fund on Halbridge Capital's current trajectory would not be raised. The firm's existing fund would lose $500 million in committed capital within 30 days. The firm's brand would not recover for years. David did not stop there. He told Marcus, in the same calm voice, that he had had a separate conversation with the other 2 partners that afternoon. The 3 of them, 3 of the firm's 6 named partners, were prepared to convene an emergency partnership meeting the following morning to consider Marcus's continued role as managing partner of the firm. The vote, David said quietly, was likely to go 4-2. The 4th vote was a partner who had been with Marcus for 9 years and who had made up her mind that after a 40-minute phone call with one of the firm's largest LPs, the 2 remaining votes, Marcus's own and 1 ally, would not be enough. Marcus listened. He looked at the photograph of his children on his desk. He looked at the photograph of his wife. He looked at the framed copy of the original Halbridge Capital Partnership Agreement from 2013, which hung on the wall behind his desk. He said very quietly, "What do you need from me? You need to reinstate her, in writing, with full authorities, no conditions. You need to issue a written apology to every LP who called you today, by tomorrow morning. You need to allow the other partners to lead the firm's response over the next 90 days, and you need to begin, with me and with the 2 other partners, a serious conversation about the long-term leadership of this firm. I am not asking you to step down today. I am asking you to recognize that the firm you built is no longer the firm you can run unilaterally. Tonight is the night the firm stops existing." Marcus called Yetunde at 8:47 p.m. The call lasted 9 minutes. He apologized. The apology was not particularly graceful, yet Tunde did not require it to be. She asked 3 questions. The first question was whether the reinstatement would be in writing and would include explicit acknowledgement that the original termination had been without cause. Marcus said yes. The second question was whether the firm's compensation committee would be reviewing her compensation in light of her continued role in the events of the day. Marcus, after a pause, said yes. The third question was whether David Castellanos would be promoted to co-managing partner with Marcus, effective immediately, with a written delineation of authorities that the partnership would ratify at its meeting the following morning. Marcus, after a longer pause, said yes. Yetunde said, "Thank you, Marcus. I will be at my desk at 8:30 tomorrow morning. Please ensure that the documentation is on my desk before I arrive." She ended the call. The partnership meeting the following morning lasted 4 hours. The documentation was on Yetunde's desk before she arrived. She read it. She signed it. She walked to David's office. The two of them began the work of running the firm. Marcus Halbridge remained co-managing partner of Halbridge Capital for 16 months following the events of that Wednesday. The arrangement was awkward, but functional. The firm did not lose any of the 6 LPs who had threatened withdrawal. The fund's next vintage, raised the following spring under David and Yetunde's joint leadership, closed at $3.8 billion, the largest in the firm's history. Marcus stepped down from the managing partner role at the conclusion of the 16-month transition period by mutual agreement of the partnership. He retained his named partner status and his economic interest in the firm. He no longer made operational decisions. He spent more time at the East Hampton house. His wife, by the account of mutual friends, was relieved. So was he. Eventually, although it took him approximately a year longer than it took her. Yetunde was promoted to managing partner alongside David at the conclusion of the 16-month transition. She did not particularly want the title. She had told David over a long dinner 6 months earlier that she preferred operational authority to symbolic recognition. David had told her, with the careful patience of a colleague who had become a friend, that the two were not in fact separable in their industry, and that her acceptance of the title would matter to the next generation of women, and the next generation of Black women in particular, who were considering whether their careers could survive in private equity. Yetunde had thought about this for 2 weeks. She had accepted the title. The Wharton MBA program, 3 years after the events of that Wednesday, invited Yetunde Okonkwo to give the keynote address at its annual Finance Career Symposium. She accepted. She did not prepare extensive remarks. She spoke for 22 minutes. She did not mention the morning of her firing. She mentioned instead her father. She told the students about the night in 2008 when her father had cried briefly on the phone with her after she had been admitted to Wharton. She told them about Howard Pemberton, who had told her she did not have enough hunger, and about Margaret Chen, who had told her she did not need to be hungry, she needed to be excellent. She told them that she had spent 20 years in an industry that had a great many ways of telling Black women that they had the wrong attitude, and that the most useful thing she had learned over those 20 years was that the people who used the phrase attitude were almost always describing, without realizing it, their own discomfort with being told something true by someone they had not expected to be told it by. She told the students that she did not particularly recommend her career to anyone who needed external validation, and that she recommended it without reservation to anyone who could find their satisfaction in the work itself. She told them that the work would eventually be the only thing nobody could take away from them. She did not take questions. She thanked the students. She walked off the stage. She returned to the airport that evening. She flew back to New York. She was at her desk by 8:30 the following morning. Faisal Al-Mansouri called her at 9:14 on a routine matter regarding their fund's quarterly reporting. She answered the call. She handled the matter. She did not mention the keynote. He did not mention the keynote. They had not, in the 3 years since the morning of the 7 phone calls, ever discussed those phone calls directly. They had not needed to. The work had continued. The relationship had continued. The fund was performing well. The next vintage would close, by their current projections, at $5 billion. Yetunde would be 60 when it closed its terminal liquidation in 11 years. She intended to retire then. She had told David at a quarterly partners' dinner the previous spring that she did not intend to do this work for one day longer than the work itself remained interesting. David had told her that he understood. He had also told her, with the small careful directness of a man who had become her partner in something more durable than a firm, that he hoped the work would remain interesting to her for a long time. She had laughed briefly in the way she rarely laughed in professional settings. She had told him she hoped so too. She had picked up her wine glass. She had returned to the conversation about the next portfolio company on the agenda.